morning, everyone. I think we've got everybody who was in the waiting room, so I'm going to get started. Thank you for joining the 8th panel in the 5th year of the Transitional Justice in the USA Speaker Series. I'm Lisa LaPlante. I direct the Center for International Law and Policy at New England Law, where I'm also a law professor. In collaboration with some 40 institutions, we launched the Speaker Series in 2021 in order to explore various themes from the field of transitional justice as they relate to the current efforts in the United States to redress racial injustice and violence. Our collective aim is to help raise national attention to this important justice movement, while also offering an innovative lens to explore the same issues arising in the US that are similar or different from experiences globally. Through these conversations, we have identified ways in which the quest for racial justice in the US has synergy with that of other traditionally marginalized people across the globe. I should note that more than ever, these types of ongoing exchanges are essential. You can view any of these past panels on our website if you're interested in seeing some of the conversations that have already occurred. Today's panel is entitled Reparations for Racialized Harms in the US. Has progress been made despite the challenges? Our amazing panelists today will be exploring the theme of reparations for racialized harms in the US, in particular offering both a historical bird's eye view of this movement, as well as the remarkable growth of town and local initiatives, as well as state and federal initiatives across the nation, and exploring different issues as it relates to both this US experience and how they relate internationally. I should note that since 2021, the Center, SILP, the Center for International Law and Policy, has also been mapping these initiatives, and we are currently finalizing our trends report, which we'll be publishing hopefully very soon, and we will be sharing it with those who are in attendance. And anyone who has registered, it'll also be on our website. So before we start, I want to thank the co-organizers of this panel, in particular, Carrie Wiggum and the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, and Carrie will be moderating this panel, as well as Elisa Massimino and Michelle Liu from the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown Law School. And Michelle will be facilitating the discussion during the Q&A period. And of course, I want to thank all the co-sponsors of this series in helping to make it inclusive and far-reaching. So just a few logistics before we get our conversation underway. The chat will be disabled during the panel's discussion. Will then be open during the Q&A, but you're always welcome to post questions in the Q&A box. And also full bibliographies, biographies of all the participants are on our website. So we won't be providing a full introduction of each speaker, although you can see at the bottom of the screen where you can visit the website for that information. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today. As I mentioned, Carrie Wiggum is an assistant professor of genocide and mass atrocity prevention at Binghamton University. He also co-directs the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. I should mention he also is a director of research and online education at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. And so, Carrie, I'll hand it to you to facilitate the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you to all for being here, and thanks especially to the panelists for coming and sharing their expertise and experiences with us about this important topic. I'm speaking to you today from New York City, so I'd like to begin with one small, however insufficient element of reparatory work myself by recognizing the original people of this land, the Lenape, as well as their deep connection to the Lenape-Hoking homeland and the resilience of the Lenape who still today continue to resist erasure. Calls for reparations for racialized harms in the United States are nothing new. They date back centuries from even before the end of legalized enslavement in this country, as we're going to be hearing. In more recent decades, those calls have become more clarion in the efforts of people like Congressman John Conyers and subsequently Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee in their yearly introduction of House Resolution 40 to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, as well as Senator Cory Booker, who's now the lead sponsor of Senate Resolution 1083, which calls for the same. Civil society organizations like the Equal Justice Initiatives have visibilized the need for reparatory strategies through the creation of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And in the last decades, we have increasingly seen municipal governments establish or attempt to establish local reparations initiatives in places like Evanston, Illinois, Asheville, North Carolina, and Providence, Rhode Island, just to name a few, though these initiatives have faced many challenges in implementation, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about as well. And these challenges are certainly not going to end anytime soon. I'd be remiss not to say that we began organizing this webinar on reparations in the US almost half a year ago, when many of us had a very different vision, or at least certainly a different hope for what the United States would look like right now. Instead, over the last 4 weeks, we have all witnessed the swift dismantling of the important, if too meager, advances that have been made in recent years when it comes to racial justice and equity. Whereas a national reparations plan seemed somewhat feasible 1 year ago, despite the challenges it would certainly face, now in a present in which organizations and individuals are being sanctioned for merely mentioning the words race or equity, it seems downright impossible. And presumably this national crackdown on DEI will have a trickle-down effect as well as state and local governments seek to avoid the ire of the current president and suffer cuts to other federal funding by pursuing initiatives like this. So I imagine these will all be points that our panelists will be bringing up over the next 80 minutes or so. I'm hoping we can speak openly about at least some of these challenges, and also think creatively about where the opportunities exist in this moment where it can be really hard for us to see those opportunities, at least for me, and I think many of us here are feeling a little hopeless at the moment. But to get things started, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists, and I think the best way to start is to begin with a little bit of a historical overview about what this struggle for reparations has been, what's happened so far, and where do we see that path going in the future. As Lisa mentioned, I'm not going to give a full bio of all of our very illustrious panelists. You can read those bios and about their incredible accomplishments and contributions on the website. But we're going to begin by turning things over to Cornell William Brooks, who is the 18th president and CEO of the NAACP and is professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, who's going to be speaking to us about a little bit of a roadmap of what reparations have looked like in the US up until now. So Cornell, please, the floor is yours.
Sure. First of all, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to our host, my panelists, the moderator, and everyone who's taking the time, particularly in this moment, this historically stressed moment, to take note of history and the call for reparations. So we're convening ourselves on a day in which Black history has been ceremonially banned across the government. A day in which, and a day on which the White House is ironically holding a Black History Month celebration at 3 p.m. And it is a moment in which Black history, a history that provides the predicate for reparations in the moment, has been called into question. But this is also a time for us to take seriously the history that calls us into this conversation, and a history where literally our forebears, our American forebears, literally call us to address reparations, even though it is difficult. So if we think about the period of slavery, and we take note of the fact that people were calling for reparations in state legislatures, in abolitionist literature, before slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. When we think about Callie House, a Black woman who was enslaved in her infancy near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, she becomes a washerwoman, as it were, and nevertheless builds an organization of 300,000 dues-paying members all across the country, calling for reparations. They called for reparations in our federal legislature, as in Congress. Well before H.R. 40, they had legislation proposing that reparations be extended to Black people based on a pretty sophisticated system of deferred compensation. And what did our forebears model this early call for reparations on? Nothing less than the Civil War pension program for Civil War veterans. And so early on, we have Callie House, hundreds of thousands of people all across the country calling for reparations. Not only that, we had federal litigation arguing that the taxes paid on cotton confiscated by the government, harvested by enslaved Black people, that the proceeds from that, the tax revenue from that, be used to compensate Black Americans based upon their uncompensated and brutalized labor over years. We come from the early 20th century, the turn of the century, to the point of Queen Audley Moore and Marcus Garvey, both of whom called for reparations. And this, of course, I want to be clear here. This is not ancient history. This is in the century before last, and there are people alive today who knew of these folks. And so we have Queen Audley Moore, we have litigation, we have Marcus Garvey, we certainly have Congressman John Conyers, who introduces legislation in the Congress, inspired in part by reparations extended not once but twice to Japanese Americans who were not detained, but incarcerated during World War II. And so we have a modern day precedent. And then I think most exciting, in the most exciting terms, we have a generation of young activists and advocates all across the country who are not only arguing for reparations in Congress, but arguing for reparations in city councils, in state legislatures, all across this country with an incredible degree of sophistication. And they're literally taking from the great analytic work of people like Bill Darity, William Darity, and Kirsten Mullen, whose book From Here to Equality provides a kind of reparations Bible, an economics Bible of the reparations movement. But this is work that is predicated on the work of Charles Ogletree, also predicated on the work of Randall Robinson. And so my point here is there's this incredible body of literature and scholarship that this advocacy in the present moment rests upon. Lastly, I would simply take note of this. Even in this seemingly despairing moment, where yet a majority of Americans are opposed to reparations, particularly cash reparations, let us take note of the fact that a majority of young people support reparations. And the number of Americans supporting reparations has increased. Last historical point, epilogue to these comments, would be this. The best example, one of the best examples of the pressing need for reparations in the present moment is the fact that we had well over 1 million veterans, Black veterans, who went to war in World War II. They came back home after having fought Hitlerism, Nazism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism abroad. They returned to the Jim Crow America, and they did not receive the benefits of the GI Bill, the educational benefits, the housing benefits. And so while the GI Bill literally created the modern middle class, created the modern suburbs, revitalized higher education, it left Black people, Black veterans behind. And so here we are in the present moment with a $16 trillion wealth gap, dollars of inequity group of advocates, many of whom are young, who are courageously taking on this fight, several of whom are on, at least one of whom is on this panel. So with that said, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So I'd love to just ask a question as a follow-up to this. I mean, you've brought up William Darity and Kirsten Mullen's incredible work on laying out a kind of ground plan for what reparations could or should look like in the United States. I mean, one thing that they raise is the notion that for reparations to be effective, it would really need to have a material impact on resolving the wealth gap that exists. Like that is actually the problem that needs to be solved with reparations. Many people say that that's too much of a burden to put on any reparations scheme because it would just, financially speaking, where is the money going to come? There are lots of, logistical and technical questions that people raise to try and shoot this down before the conversation even begins in many ways. I'm curious what you think about what the central objectives of a reparations scheme would need to be in the US to achieve the goals that it needs to achieve. Is there is the simple symbolic fact that a reparations initiative would begin, would that be enough? Or would it in your view, need to resolve that, have enough of a material impact to resolve wealth inequality as it currently exists in the US?
Sure. So let's start with the premise of the question that it is financially impossible, fiscally impossible to provide reparations for Black Americans. My colleague at the Harvard Kennedy School, Professor Linda Bilmes, and I wrote a paper in which we took on what we call the three impossibilities or presumed impossibilities of reparations. One, that it is fiscally impossible, simply exorbitantly expensive and impossible to finance. Two, temporally impossible, which is the harms, the racial harms of reparations, necessitating reparations, took place too long ago. And lastly, the administrative impossibility. It's simply too difficult to programmatically address. So when we look at the fiscal argument, let us be clear. We did an analysis of racial harms, what we call a taxonomy of racial harms, and then we did an audit of federal programs that look like reparations. We examined dozens and dozens and dozens of programs that provide what look like reparations, or what we call reparatory compensation, for non-racial harms to the tune of not millions, but billions, even trillions of dollars when we consider veterans and their harms. And so let's take a pause here by not killing the idea of reparations in its infancy, because we assume we have too little money. So when it comes to farmers who have crops that are beset by some kind of natural disaster or pestilence, and there's a crop failure, we, till this day, provide billions of dollars to farmers. When a military base closes or there's a trade agreement that hurts a community, we provide millions and billions of dollars to those communities for economic assistance, for loans, for community revitalization. When there's a bad vaccine that hurts children, we will provide millions of dollars. And so when we look at all of these programs, it is clear to us not that the money will be easy to get, but it can be gotten. Point one. Point two is that when it comes to Black people, when we look at all these federal programs going back decades, there seems to be what I call an my author and I call an asymmetric evidentiary burden, which is to say Black people have to prove it over a longer period of time against a greater presumption of doubt than others. And so I would simply encourage my fellow Americans and certainly fellow citizens, and certainly everybody in this movement, let us not assume it's too expensive, particularly when we've not, with the exception of Professor Darity and Dr. Mullen, really not spent time grappling with the cost, right? And last point here is, in no other instance of reparations do we assume we have to have the price tag and the means to pay for it before we begin. And every other reparatory program, it's iterative. When it came to Jewish people in the Holocaust, there were various kinds of reparatory efforts. With Japanese Americans, various kinds of embryonic, iterative reparatory efforts. So with Black folks, why do we have to pay up front, prove up front before we can even start?
Thanks so much for that. Just one other question before we move on to the next panelist. I think one thing you've raised and had a really good critique of these arguments that often come up before we even start talking about reparations. Another one that will often be raised is the idea that, okay, how do we figure out who's going to be a recipient of the reparations? How do people need to prove direct ancestry to someone who was enslaved? But of course, there's also the question, I mean, there are Black Americans who have moved to the US after slavery ended, but are still very much suffering the same kinds of racialized harms that are happening, even if their ancestors were not enslaved in the United States. Do you have any thoughts about that question of who should be the recipients of reparations and how we determine equitably that question?
Sure. So let's think about this. So when it comes to racialized harms, there's a suggestion that we need DNA tests, we need the receipts of those who have been enslaved. And let me be clear here, I come from the low country of South Carolina. My family has a great number of receipts with respect to our forebears being enslaved. But when we look at how this country does reparations, let's look at the facts. As a matter of law, we have reparatory programs for non-racial harms that operate on the principle of presumptive eligibility, which is to say, if a person is near the harm at the time of the harm, we will assume they were harmed. The reason the government does this is because it's administratively easier to do. So let's look at some concrete examples. When Black folks had conventional bombs dropped from the heavens onto their heads in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, here we are 100 years later, none of those folks have received a dime. And we're going around asking ourselves, well, who was in Tulsa? Well, first of all, we've not extended reparations and not had a serious conversation about those victims. But let's look at nuclear bombs dropped from the sky in the Marshall Islands, where we had people whose homes were decimated, whose health and bodies were decimated. In that case, we looked at who was near the harm, who could be presumed to be harmed, and we extended health benefits, economic benefits, we extended assistance, we extended what we call reparatory compensation. We presume that they were harmed and compensated them. Last point here, which is if we want to reduce reparations to some kind of matter of DNA and genetics, let's get away from identity per se and look at kinds of harms, right? So they're the harms that extend directly from slavery, but also the harms that extend from Jim Crow. Let's take two prominent examples. There's an late actor by the name of Sidney Poitier, first Black man to win an Oscar. And Harry Belafonte, who by himself almost financed the civil rights movement. These are Black Americans who came from the Caribbean, lived in the Jim Crow South, risked death and mayhem. My point being here is we don't need to get engaged in the brown paper bag test or the one drop rule when it comes to recognizing racial harms. My great grandmother, her complexion was like yours. Mine is brown. My mother's colors are altogether different color. My point being is I'm not so concerned about the pigmentation of reparations as opposed to the possibility and the likelihood and the feasibility of reparations.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more to talk about in the Q&A, but now I want to move on to our second panelist, who is Joy Banner, one of the co-founders of the Descendants Project, a fantastic organization working in Louisiana's river parishes to preserve and protect the health, land, and lives of the Black descendant community living there. And I'm so excited to have Joy here to talk about sort of the broad scope that this reparatory work and how it can take, and how it's also connected to questions of environmental justice. So Joy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And wow, that's a tough act to follow. You can see me furiously taking down notes, Cornell, because everything that you're saying is just so powerful. And quite honestly, I'm ready to start activating some of these strategies in the community that I live in. I am the co-founder and co-director of the Descendants Project. Me as in my twin sister, we had a nonprofit that focuses on the wealth and well-being, health and well-being of the descendants of people that were enslaved in plantations that are literally in our backyards. So we are in between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, to give you a geographical layout. There were hundreds of plantations. And now we have a plantation tourism industry that has been a pretty strong one for the past 50 or so years. And those plantations, which you might be surprised to learn that they don't focus on the narratives of people that were enslaved. They don't focus on how do we ensure that those descendants of people that were enslaved at our sites, are getting some type of reparatory justice, or are being represented. Those tours instead focus on architecture, the furniture, the wealth, the glamour. I've heard plantations referred to by scholars as our own castles on the Rhine. It's just crazy. My sister just was part of a documentary called Vacation Plantation that's on Amazon Prime. You must see it. You must see the just craziness that we are living with. But and there's one, I will say that I'm fortunate to be the director of communications at Whitney Plantation, which is one of the only plantations, one of the few plantations that actually centered slavery. And I'm also a descendant of people that were enslaved. Whitney is one of those plantation sites that, literally, again, is in my backyard. And so it's been a part of my landscape for my entire life. What is also a consequence of slavery is the fact that the same geographic area is now known as Cancer Alley. So these huge parsonages of land that was developed by the extraction of labor from not only the indigenous people, but the enslaved people, it cleared millions of acres of land. So the environmental degradation started as soon as the industrialization started, right? And it was most economically beneficial to have these plantations lined up along the Mississippi River. That was your trade route. Now, in modern times, these plants came in around the same time as the EPA gets started. They're looking for places that who is going to allow pollution to happen? Where will we find massive amounts of land? And where will we find as few people who own this massive amounts of land? So guess what? The plantation structure in Louisiana was the perfect place. It was still a place where you have 4 or 5 people, 1 or 2 families that are descended from plantations that still own thousands of acres. So they rolled right in and said, hey, sell me your plantation. That might have been 1 or 2 people making that decision, right? And then now you have a plantation, a plant that used to be a plantation. And guess what's along the fence line of these former plantations is descendant communities like mine. Because after the Civil War, after the Civil War, men who fought in the Civil War for their freedom, and I say their families fought in the Civil War, right? Because as the men were out fighting, it was the women and children that are still at these plantations that are still can you imagine a soldier going off to fight? You've self-emancipated, but your family is still on the plantation, right? So think about what is happening there in order for families to support freedom, of Civil War soldiers and other people. So I really like to say is the families that are fighting the Civil War. They're just in 2 different fronts. But anyway, after the Civil War, remember a big part of the reason why the enslaved are fighting is because they are being promised land. We have accounts in Louisiana where when the plantation owners flee, the enslaved people take over and run that plantation. And they're like, look, we have been doing this all along. So they're expecting that they will have those plantations. They're being told that they will have that land. After the Civil War and after Lincoln is assassinated and you have President Johnson, those promises of land are no longer there, right? So now you have people, instead of saying oh, well, we're done. It is enslaved, the formerly enslaved said, let's get together. Let's put our money together and create these spaces. And that's what they did. And my community of Wallace that I am sitting right here in, is a Freetown community. So that is the kind of history when we talk about reparations and restoration, that kind of history that is not being told, that is repertory and restorative as well. Not to diminish, the importance of the material wealth and the wealth gap, because that's all associated, right, with the plantation system. That is like when you learn about the history, that makes the financial part of it makes more sense. When I talk about the fact that my ancestor, that Mississippi River that you still using for industry and you still have this infrastructure for, guess who built those levees? Guess who built those roads and those routes that you're still using? So we are still contributing, greatly to the economics of the river parishes and the global economy. So part of our work with the Descendants project is that we were a few years ago in 2020. Our community is constantly targeted by industry. We were directly targeted by a grain terminal called Greenfield, a grain depot only a mere feet away from our house, that would have dumped 140 tons of pollution already in Cancer Alley. So we are Cancer Alley because of that pollution. 95% higher risk of cancer than the rest of the country. So this would have been a situation where we wouldn't have been able to handle the dust from the grain terminal. We would have had rats, rodents. We would have had 30,000 trucks, heavy trucks in our community a year. It was simply, we could not handle it. It would have ruined our community. So Joe and I, my twin sister and I, we organized, and for the last 3 years, we were fighting this grain terminal. And part of that fight we pushed for a review of the historic and cultural resources as is written in the law, federal historic preservation law. If you have a federal permit or get federal funding, there must be a consideration of those historic resources. And if it's believed to be an area with extensive resources, then it kicks off what you call a Section 106 review. And ours was through the Corps of Engineers because that's where the permit was coming from. Well, as we as a community gathered researchers, scholars, plantation descendants, and plantation owners. So that is where my background as someone who's been in a community their whole life and actually had worked at various plantations up and down the river, most of which I'm descended from. And because I had navigated and negotiated really tough conversations and relationships with plantation owners, because you know what, those plantation owners, it takes a certain type of personality and character to run and manage a plantation. But at the end of the day, and that we became a family in this fight. I will say it, and we pushed for and received eligibility status, a National Register Historic District, a National Historic Landmark that would have protected 22,000 acres of land through Cancer Alley that would not have been industrialized. Unfortunately, we found out a couple of days ago, officially Monday, that the Trump administration has rescinded our eligibility status. So that does not take away our eligibility, but this was a move prompted by our Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. That's who reached out to the National Park Service and said, take this away, we need industry and business in those acres. And those acres through Cancer Alley. So we had a big press conference this Monday with the Port of South Louisiana, touted the Trump administration, repeatedly thanked the Trump administration, damned the Biden and Harris administration for allowing so much federal oversight. So now here we are, that eligibility status, unprecedented, right? Unprecedented. This was taken away from us only a couple of days ago. That was a huge portion of the repertory and restorative justice, that our culture was being protected, our history was being protected, but more importantly, our health. That would have prevented the build out of any heavy industry, like our lands, the reforestation, our river would have been cleaner, our air would have been cleaner. And now we're not back to square one, but like we're square two. When we were like at square 99, if we're counting out of 100 squares, we're like at square two. So I'll end there. Sorry I couldn't end on a happier note, but that's the reality of the consequences and consequences of slavery in the plantation economy.
Thank you so much, Joy, for that. And it's so devastating to hear about this move by the Trump administration. And I imagine it's something that local communities around the country are facing now, or are going to be facing very soon. The use of technicality to try to diminish and dismantle these efforts that are happening at local levels. One thing that you and your work raises, and this goes back to the conversation we were having with Cornell about where the money comes from for reparations. I mean, your work really points to the fact that we often focus on the money needing to come exclusively from the federal government, but actually corporations have had a massive role in racialized harms and the continuation of racialized harms in the US. And obviously corporations have a lot of money. So I'm curious, what your views are on the need for involving corporations in this broader policy of trying to create reparations for racialized harms in the US, and what your experience has been working with and engaging with corporate actors in the work that you're doing.
That's a really good question, and it's really tricky for me. I believe that corporations who understand that the consequences of what their production, pollution, their environmental harm that they're causing, I do think that they should be held responsible. However, and I guess because you're talking with someone who's coming from a very, very corrupt government. And if you don't have a government that is supporting the corporations, right? Like, so even the corporations doing their harm is the government's responsibility. Like they're issuing it, and well, there's a lot of it tied in together because there's so much corporate capture, there's so much corporations that are embedded in those governments. Then yes, I think it's still more of a government responsibility. However, corporations will continue to do harm unless they're held equally as accountable. And it has to be if they think that there is a lawsuit that's going to come, and that's the case with us still in Cancer Alley. And even with these historic designations, that still doesn't make you free from us having class action lawsuits against the harm that you've done. So there's still other ways that we are going to fight. But yes, they do bear a big responsibility. If you know the facts, we have to be held accountable in terms of cleaning up our environment and having a restorative plan.
Just curious, Joy, if you could talk a little bit as well about the process that you've gone through of involving the local descendant community and even communities of people who are not descendants in the work that you're doing. How have you worked alongside and with the broader community in achieving your goals?
Yes, and that's another good question. One of what we want to do with the Descendants Project. First of all, we've been able to reach out to another descendant community because also last year, about a year ago, we also acquired the plantation where the largest slave rebellion in the United States, the Woodland Plantation. The 1811 rebellion. There's still a descendant community around that plantation, so it's been really nice to engage with their descendant community. But like in order to expand and extend, I think it all becomes an issue of yes, we're a Black descendant community and we have rights and we have this. We have a category in this plantation economy, in this tourism economy, like being able to say, like you have this attachment to the plantation, it's where your ancestors were, but like you're a person living in the here and the now, and to navigate, the good and the bad of it. We didn't have an identity for it. That descendant identity, I think, puts it all together in one spot. So emotionally, we can start to tackle, like, what does that mean for us financially? What does that mean for our quality of life? So it's a foundation, it's a good starting block for where we can orient ourselves in time, which I think is difficult for African Americans. Like what's past, what's future, what should you embrace, what should you not embrace? And I feel like that descendant identity is helping us come to accept and engage with our own futures that we can co-create together.
Thank you so much for that and sharing your work with us. I want to turn now to our next panelist, who is Jason Heath, a national reparations advocate and expert, who's going to talk to us about her work around the United States, working on reparations initiatives today and the successes and challenges that she sees, both in the last 5 years, but now these new challenges that are emerging under this new administration. So Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carrie, and good morning, everyone. Grateful to be here, grateful to be alive. No day is promised. I always start that way because my ancestors had to survive unsurvivable conditions to be here, for me to be here. So I acknowledge that every day. Thank you to you all, to my esteemed co-panelists, to the co-organizers. So deeply appreciative for your just resilience in the fight, but also your vulnerability in offering, pathways forward. Also, any place where Cornell sets the tone is a good place to be. So you all are in the right place. And in order to really digest what's happening, where we must course correct in real time, what's possible, what we must remain vigilant about as we press on to actualize reparations, both in the US, but also across the diaspora, because this is a rippling effect movement. And so, as you've heard from my colleague Cornell and Joy and others, Carrie has pointed out as well, reparations are not a theoretical exercise or political impossibility, routine practice, just not often for Black communities. And so what we seek is not unprecedented and should never be framed as such. And within the reparations processes within the United States, they rarely begin with institutions acting in good faith, right? Rather, they are the result of descendants and impacted communities and advocates forcing institutions to acknowledge harm. We see the cycle play out repeatedly across the country. Community-led demands are developed, followed by, pressure and action, followed by then the response of these government institutions or private corporations or churches or academic institutions, establishing a commission or a task force, there being an investigation into the harms, both past and present. So I'm grateful to Joy and her incredible work in illuminating present day harms of environmental racism. These harm reports across the country detail, harms ranging during enslavement, post-emancipation apartheid, and modern day harms. Abusive policing is a part of that. Housing discrimination, discriminatory zoning, education loss, political disenfranchisement, lack of access to healthcare, and lower life expectancy rates. Like, this is all within the scope of reparations. And then too often recommendations are ignored or shelved for many years, diluted or delayed indefinitely. Or recommendations are posing as reparations, or reparations task forces are posing as reparations, and they are actually what the government should be doing on a daily basis for direct relief and to preserve the social safety net. So there are some differences that we need to investigate further, and there's also this trend of investigate but not implement. And so you see the harms reports released. Most of these commissions, government-led commissions, are requesting an extension for research and budget and resources. The resources are separated from the actual reparative mechanisms, so there's no direct allocation within the commission to then fund the material reparations. We've seen a wave of official apologies with limiting clauses in them that exclude legal and political remedies to be pursued because of the culpability documented through the apology. And then you often get the apology without material reparations or material reparations coming later down the line. So at the federal level, HR 40 has been mentioned by many of my colleagues already. And again, that's something on the heels of the Civil Liberties Act passing, granted by President Ronald Reagan. And I just want to say that out loud, right? Because we're in these political times, and I will circle back to this point, but possibilities, right? I've had the honor of working on this bill directly, HR 40, the last several years with the mentorship and guidance of elders in the movement, and getting it over 197 co-sponsors, getting it to its first Judiciary Committee vote ever in 2021. But instead of using the political will to pass and implement HR 40, there was a unanimous decision to, and even with the support of Republicans, right, to pass a $118 million holiday in Juneteenth, which could have been seed funding for federal reparations program, right? So just thinking about these choices that our political leadership are making. Advocates have pushed the Biden-Harris administration previously to full capacity to deliver directly on the executive order. The Biden-Harris administration did not come through, leaving that up to the whims of this administration. Public reintroduction of HR 40 and S40, the accompanying legislation, happened this last week. And so we're thrilled to have, brilliant, innovative leadership and Representative Ayanna Pressley, who's following in the legacies of John Conyers and Sheila Jackson Lee. But we're excited for that breathing of new life and innovation into this movement. To supplement HR 40, though, in partnership with Forever Congresswoman Cori Bush, we designed, outlined the Reparations Now resolution, which is basically an outline of an ideal reparations omnibus bill, because we realized too that HR 40 has been deliberately stalled and blocked for now 3 decades, right? You need another. There are possibilities to introduce direct implementation bills, in addition to still calling for a full investigation of these range of harms. And so the Reparations Now resolution outlines both the scope of the harms that need to be investigated, but also ways in which compensation, restitution, and other measures can be delivered. So on the state, and I just want to say too that advocates have been working specifically also to advance a reparative justice agenda. So this means taking various pieces of legislation that exist, the Tulsa-Greenwood Claims Accountability Act, the RAPT Act, which is basically reparations for intellectual property for Black artists, TRHT legislation, Congresswoman Barbara Lee's legislation around truth, racial healing, and transformation, HR 40, Reparations Now, bringing that agenda forward as something that needs to be adopted fully. And that was a tactic, that got us to where we were with our calls for the executive order. On the state and local levels, we're seeing both progress and pitfalls. California has made the news a lot with its, efforts to set a new precedent. There is ongoing battles around implementation and resourcing. In New Jersey, I've had the privilege of supporting the New Jersey Reparations Council in response to the state legislature's failure to pass reparations legislation. So the community and the Institute for New Jersey Institute for Social Justice took it upon themselves to make their own council and produce a report. you have everywhere from DC to Providence to Greenbelt to Evanston to Palm Springs, right, to celebrate. Palm Springs and Evanston, doling over $2 million already in its reparations fund. Palm Springs, using legal remedy to seek, or legal pathways to seek remedy. Erring on the side of caution for programs, within Providence and Greenbelt, which try to tackle two grave and egregious harms of, settler colonialism and the legacy of enslavement. My recommendation would be to separate those processes to ensure the full and thoroughness of each of those issues, but also to not limit them, such as Providence has, and open them up to white recipients through an income requirement that is a part of their program as well. So anyone making under $50,000 is eligible, and the majority of $50,000 households in Providence are white-headed households. I just want to say in closing, just as mainstream narratives overlooked self-emancipation efforts by enslaved Africans prior to, supposed legalized emancipation, mainstream narratives often overlook the reality that there are local communities independently organizing for their reparations. As Joy has already spoken to, I've supported families in places like Schuler Fields, Arkansas, where it's a matter of the minerals underneath the ground that Black communities have been displaced. The federal government and private companies bidding on lithium for renewable energy sources, but continuing to commit harms on Black families all the way, California, Alabama, Texas, Forsyth County, places in Massachusetts. So let's not lose our eyes on things, on efforts that are not by the book, government-led, institution-led, because there are a whole lot of other efforts happening. And to this point about, federal reparations being impossible in this particular moment, I want to address that specifically. And I truly believe that is untrue because as has been spoken earlier, again, Ronald Reagan granted Japanese Americans reparations. Richard Nixon, to distract us from the racist drug war, gave us the MLK holiday. Belinda Sutton was petitioning for her reparations while being enslaved in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Ron DeSantis, even a modern day example, has been renewing full scholarships for the 1921 Ocoee descendants, 1920 massacre of the Ocoee descendants, full scholarships. And so this impossibility narrative only serves those who benefit from inaction. And we must remain vigilant, obviously, that reparations could be weaponized for political gain, but to excise the actual possibility that this is possible at the federal, state, local, institutional, and community levels, prevents the full livelihood and thriving of Black communities for now and to come.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And I really appreciate that that last point in particular. I guess my own depression at the moment is maybe taking over when I call it impossible, but you're absolutely right. This is something so important to remember, that even bringing that into the ether is a damaging and self-defeating narrative. So thanks for that. I'm curious if you could talk about, as we see these local reparations initiatives taking shape, many of them have taken a lot of different forms, from direct compensation to small business loans to a lot of different forms they've taken. I'm wondering if you could talk about if there are any lessons learned or guiding principles that you've seen where there's been particular success in the forms that these local reparatory initiatives can take.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. I would say first off that, these processes are not one size fits all. Every community has a unique identity and composition with unique harms to respond to. And so, to also, there can be blueprints for these processes, but also they are supposed to form and be created in response to the unique harms, and that it may not fit neatly in a blueprint. And so I just want to name that. And I also want to say that there have been success. I mean, we have brought up Evanston, Illinois, which, prior to Evanston, Chicago, the city of Chicago releasing one of the most comprehensive reparations programs for police torture victims, which, includes direct compensation. It includes free trauma-informed care, not just for the survivors themselves, but for their family members, because we know that trauma extends throughout the entire family and throughout the community. That program also includes free education to the city colleges for survivors and their families. And so I've seen that replicated also within these repertory-like processes that Cornell has described, even at the federal level. When you look at the 9/11 Victims Restitution Fund, right, where there is, healthcare benefits for people who were exposed to the ashes during the time of 9/11. And so when I'm thinking about communities like Joy's, like these are routine practices that we respond to. And narratively, no one is saying, we have funded this reparations program continually. And that is often what is then used against Black folks' quest to achieve reparations. You've also had efforts, so the local efforts are ranging from infancy, the germination stages of the harms report to how do we figure out and implement this. In California, you had the official apology with the permanent marker. You had the $12 million that was allocated Governor Newsom not taking up some of the reparations bills, or in the case of the eminent domain bill, vetoing the bill. He had already allocated, $12 million to, help serve the repertory process in California. And so, in places like DC, I want to lift up DC's effort because their process, I think, is one of the more innovative from the beginning, because it also, and this, is also obviously subject to federal jurisdiction, but this is a process that not only had a commission, but had a fund and a allocation process for the fund attached with the commission proposal. So not only would you be passing a task force to do the investigation, you would be also passing a revenue source to be collecting sources while the task force is doing its work to then help implement the material reparations.
Thank you so much for that. And now I want to move to our final panelists. And we've been focusing on the US, but now we want to bring in Yemima Garcia Godos, who is a professor at the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo, who's going to give us a little bit more of an international perspective and talk about how reparations programs have worked in other countries around the world, and maybe what are some of the lessons that we could, that would be applicable to the case of the United States as we try to solve these issues as well. So Yemima, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much to Lisa and the organizers for inviting me to join this conversation. Of course, we all wanted it would be more auspicious circumstances to gather us here, but well, this is what we have. Let me start telling, I want to I've been asked to focus on the international, give this an international perspective. And I was going to start by saying that the United and the American experiences that you just presented were unprecedented. But from what I've been presented, I mean, listening to you, this is not unprecedented. It has been going on for over 100 years in the US. And I think then that actually the transitional justice debate has much to learn from these reparations debates and processes that you have talked about. But I want to start by focusing then on the different points of departures that there are between the processes going on in the US and transitional justice as a field of inquiry, academic inquiry, and as a field of practice, because they're very different, and I think they set a different tone. And transitional justice, as we know it, then comes from the transition to democracy in the taking place in the late 70s, 80s, over the 90s, and the focus was then in this the transitions from authoritarian rule of various forms. It could be military dictatorships in South America. It could be authoritarian rule in Eastern Europe, etc. And then, well, in the 90s with the Rwanda genocide and the Balkan Wars, then it's almost a bit naturally that the focus was very much into victims of violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And so that sort of, that was the center of the attention for transitional justice practices and mechanisms, the various mechanisms. So what I find fascinating for what I've heard today is that, well, you're focusing very broadly on reparations. For us, transitional justice practitioners or researchers, reparations is just one of many mechanisms, of several mechanisms, right? Of course, some of us would like to highlight reparations much more than others, but still, it's only one of the mechanisms of transitional justice. And so it was actually this year we will be celebrating the 20 years of the UN Basic Principles on the Right to Remedy and Reparations, which establish very clearly what victims' rights is about: justice, truth, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition. And it set up this international standards on reparation. And it also provided very much needed conceptual and operational clarification at that time. The year was 2005. Now, moving on towards the end of the 2010s, and Lisa was one of the first researchers, academics, to starting questioning about this focus on violations only, and start to think about socioeconomic rights or socioeconomic structures, right? Was transitional justice only supposed to focus on violations? Or what about the context in which these violations occurred? What about the structural inequalities of these societies? And a very interesting debate arose from those questionings. And especially, I think that today, most people in transitional justice would say, yes, we need to address structural inequalities, but there's no much agreement about how exactly. Because the question is, aren't these structural inequalities existing there the job of governments and states or authorities and politicians, but not the job of transitional justice practitioners? Right, so there is a debate that it doesn't have an answer yet, but I think what could contribute from here to the debate is something that the Colombians came up with in around the 2010, 2011, and it's this idea of transformative reparations. They were critical to the fact that reparations were just going to restitute or restore the situation of the victim right at the moment when harm was done, right? And then they said, hey, but wait a second. What about if this victim was living in a situation of poverty, experiencing discrimination, experiencing oppression or violence, etc.? What about their life projects? What shouldn't reparation instead try to help out to develop that life project that was stopped, that was blocked because when harm was done, right? And this idea of transformative reparation has actually, it was first met with a bit of a skepticism. It was very idealistic and inspiring, but at the same time, hey, how are we going to do this? But at the same time, later on, experience has shown that it was built into the legislation, and it has actually guided the design of reparation programs in Colombia, and has served as a source also of inspiration to other programs. So the reason why I'm making this this sort of like historical overview from the point of view of transitional justice is that finally. I think transitional justice, by way of your experiences in the US, it's meeting the historical injustice debate, right? About 20 years ago, when one started to search about the reparations, do a Google search on reparations, what came up, it was reparations on the slavery. Then comes in transitional justice, takes over the floor, and we're focusing only on victim reparations in terms of transitional justice. And sort of there have been two debates that should have been converged much earlier and learn from each other and nurture each other instead of being separated, as it has been the case until now. So this is just a little bit about this, this overview. And I just want to tell you that part of this process of learning from the American experience has actually, it's meeting the objectives or a new approach from someone as important as a special rapporteur on human rights. Actually, there was a report from 2021 where they raised the issue of the legacy of colonial context. So what we're talking about is legacies of colonialism, of slavery, of the displacement of or dispossession of indigenous peoples, etc., etc. It hasn't received much attention, but it's due time to take a look at that. And I think it's very good to see that transitional justice is engaging into these issues. Now, I was also asked to reflect a little bit about how the American experience resembles or differs from reparations programs in other countries around the world. And I think the clearest difference is that in most countries, it is the national government that starts victim reparations, right? It is welcome, obviously, from civil society, from victim organizations, from other actors, but it is the state that takes initiative. Perhaps it's not so surprising because their programs are usually implemented as a follow-up of their recommendations by a truth commission. So first, you clarify the truth, the events, the processes that took place, you identified that actually violations have been committed. So it does provide legitimacy, a legitimate ground in order to move with reparations to address the needs of the victims that are then identified. So this is a very important difference. And I'm glad to hear that there are certain initiatives in the US at the federal level, but in most cases, it is just the local communities, as we heard here. So without having this legitimacy, identifying a group, there is the need for reparations. It's very hard to move on. Now, from the Latin American experience, we also see that the definition of victim has expanded. And I'm thinking in terms of what kind of violations are included in the definition of victims. First of all, coming from the Latin American dictatorships, arbitrary execution, torture, forced recruitment, sexual violence, etc., right? But what happens then the moment you include internal displacement, right? You go from a few thousands to 8 million or almost 9 million people in Colombia. So it is not only about the numbers themselves, but it's also about the likelihood of implementation. And much has been said here about budgets, about the limitations of funding, but it is actually very pressing and challenging situation also for countries coming out of authoritarian rule. So, so I guess that then the challenge in the US, it's you, Carrie, mentioned it, how do we define the beneficiary? In reparation programs, we would say, well, how do we define the victim, right? That definition, it's a very strong, it's a hot potato. It's a very difficult way to issue, needs to be defined, needs to be discussed, but it's very political as well, right? Transitional justice hasn't has worked its way through by identifying violations or perhaps identifying the victim by way of perpetrators. But concerning the cases such as the legacy of colonialism or slavery, then it's a different situation. I think I'm going to leave it there. So just to give a little bit of time for any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Amima. And I think I have time for one question before I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Michelle Liu, who's going to ask questions. If any of you in the audience have questions, please hit the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and feel free to type them in. But Yamima, you brought up at the beginning of your talk very correctly that reparations is only one mechanism in this broad swath of mechanisms that exist in transitional justice. And it made me think of this other principle of transitional justice, the idea of complementarity, that these mechanisms are supposed to work alongside of each other and complement the work of other mechanisms. I'm curious if you can think of any, or if you have any thoughts on examples or ways where reparation schemes have done that particularly well, have really succeeded at complementing other transitional justice initiatives that might be informative for the US case.
Well, let's think of the case of Colombia, right? Colombia started its transitional justice process long before the armed conflict stopped. And actually, they started with administrative reparation programs before the Truth Commission. Well, they did have some truth-seeking initiatives, but they were not exactly a Truth Commission. So somehow they were preparing the ground for the Truth Commission that came up and delivered its report a few years ago. So again, the Truth Commission that was formed, it had a legitimacy. It had a legitimacy because it was formed by the government, by the state. It was at the national level. In the United States, it would require much more debate, or perhaps would be more challenging to decide about what a mandate for a Truth Commission could be. And then also in Colombia, we have semi-judicial processes and judicial processes going on, identifying the main perpetrators. But here again, we're focusing on human rights violations or specific violations of humanitarian law. In terms of the slavery, it would be very difficult to identify these perpetrators.
Thank you so much for that. And let me say before I turn things over to Michelle, thank you all so much for your thoughts and comments. This has been a really wonderful conversation. Now I'm going to pass things on to my colleague, Michelle Liu from the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown Law School, who's going to, I'm sure, have her own questions and then also maybe involve some of the audience questions into this conversation.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you to all the panelists. This has been such a fascinating and actually really inspiring conversation. So I appreciate all of you and for the opportunity to have to hold this space today. If anyone has any questions, please plop them into the Q&A and I will keep an eye on those. But in the meantime, I do have follow-up questions for each of the panelists and happy to kind of go in turn. For Cornell, you had mentioned in the beginning that the majority of young people do support reparations. And I'm wondering if in your or any other panelists' experiences, have you seen any differences in what reparations means to young people versus to older generations? And then also just thinking about the context and the political climate that we're in now, where things can feel so challenging, and I hate to use the word impossible, but feel so like such an uphill battle. Do you all see opportunity now to really sort of focus on education of the younger population and try to get them more steeped in the movement through an awareness and an education of the history?
Sure. Well, let me just say that my co-panelists are at least as well able to respond to this question, perhaps better able than I can. But I'll draw upon the experience I've had. So we have a clinic, a public policy clinic at the Kennedy School, where we work with reparations groups across the country, where we take Kennedy's school students and students from across Harvard who work to implement reparations, often at the state and local level. And I've come to appreciate two things. One, that there are a great many young people, because they're much more historically literate than their parents, they know more, and as a consequence are more supportive of reparations. Point one. Point two, they tend to look at reparations in a much more intersectional lens. They understand reparations both in a global context and certainly with respect to the ways in which people have been oppressed and harmed, even in the context of racial harms. So in other words, sometimes older people tend to look at reparations in terms of merely lost land, violence, as opposed to political crimes, crimes with respect to theft, reparations with respect to health. And so they're much more likely to look at a multiplicity of harms, the way in which those harms intersect. And as a consequence, they're much more supportive of reparations and much more open to it. Point two. Point three, one of the things I've noticed with respect to younger advocates when it comes to reparations is because they're more historically literate, they're less likely to assume that this is impossible and that there's nothing we can do. Because if you think about Callie House at the turn of the last century, having an organization of 300,000 dues-paying members, and here we are in a blue sky social media age, and we say we can't do this, right? How many people are being lynched? How many people like Callie House were thrown into jail as a consequence of their reparations advocacy? I'm not saying the work is not dangerous now, but it's most certainly less dangerous now than it was then. Last point I want to make here is that I'm encouraged by literally the sheer number of people, right? When a colleague of mine introduced me to Dreesen and her work, frankly, I was shocked at the sheer number of people just working on this. And I'm a fairly sophisticated civil rights lawyer, but to discover both the magnitude, the creativity, the programmatic imagination, right? So this whole idea that we can't do this because there are limited number of ways to do it. Look at what's being done at the local level. Look what's being ideated at the local level. In other words, people are looking at all kinds of harms, looking at all kinds of programmatic responses. They're looking at transitional justice responses, traditional responses. They're looking at new forms of scholarship, engaging artists in the work. And so my point being here is this is a moment of a really expansive creativity and moral imagination. And people are practical. They're creating commissions, they're engaging scholars, they're organizing, and then just frankly not taking no. Right. So that would be my take.
Thank you, Cornell. I don't know if the other panelists have anything to add to that. Great. Well, I have another follow-up question. I think Dreesen was the one who mentioned talking about, at the community level, each community having its own unique harms, a unique identity to the community. and that there's no, sort of universal blueprint that one can follow to really get these movements off the ground. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, for advocates looking to start a reparations initiative in their community, is there sort of a common starting point that they could think about? And what does that look like?
Yeah, thank you for that. And, would love to, shout out First Repair's work, as a starting point for, they have all types of toolkits and tools to support local communities that want to initiate, petition government to start a commission, do a harms report, do the additional, material reparations work, get organized in your community. I also think it just starts with, people closeness, people trying to revive their peoplehood and their communityhood, and finding that they're having the same issues and the same problems, the same ways folks historically have had, impromptu community town halls at the church or at the local community center where there's, a series of issues identified. Oh, you are also coughing because of this air, so am I, so are my child, so is so-and-so 2 doors down the way. And getting back to our peoplehood as the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America and COBRA often advocates for, I think, is a huge starting point, acknowledging each other, acknowledging our shared experiences. But then it is, getting together in somebody's living room in a safe place to organize around, like, what do we actually want? Some communities just want a permanent marker. Some communities want the whole menu. They want compensation. They want the permanent markers. They want an end to the police violence. They want the education curriculum. They want the official apology. They want the free legal services and the free health care, right? Like these are the deliberations that need to be up to community. And so maybe that's through a community survey, but maybe that's also through, door knock, like using the political tactics we use around civil engagement, also to reinvigorate community around the possibilities of what repair looks like. Like so often people are disarmed of the power of advocating for themselves and their worthiness around these particular issues, that they don't even know, like, I can, petition and ask and demand for these things, right? Other communities are getting resources in perpetuity, right? And not even question, right? It's not a political or social question that Holocaust survivors receive reparations in perpetuity to this day, right? We are not questioning that. We are questioning, we are trying to see what polls, do white people support reparations? Like, are those, were we sending out polls to Black communities when highways were being constructed through their communities? Were we sending out polls when we, administered reparations for Holocaust survivors? No, we weren't. We were just doing what was right. And so reinvigorating that spirit into communities, designing a strategy, right, which is going to look different for every community, and then a plan of action, like, what is the strategic communications? That's also a huge part of this. Like, we've had to transform and work with journalists, right, to present more human-centered stories around reparations. That's why you're seeing the profiles on the North Carolina eugenics victims and survivors who, and their descendants. That's why you're seeing more human-centered narratives around Tulsa race massacre survivors and their descendants. That's why you're seeing follow-up profiles on Evanston's recipients of reparations and how they are using their reparations to better their lives, right? And so telling these stories is also a part of the strategic organizing plan that I think communities have to think more about locally. And then how do you connect your local effort to the national effort, to the global movement for reparations? And don't get lost in, get lost in your current conditions, but don't lose sight of the fact that your current conditions are connected with this diasporic struggle.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dreesen. And I think that gets at Eric's question, but let me ask that in full to see if you have anything more to add to that. So the question is, advocates of the US federal system often point to the virtue of having laboratories for policy experimentation across the country. So some of the panelists' comments suggest this may be the case. Interested in pros and cons to this sort of a fragmented approach. Yes, Cornell.
So this presents a classic dilemma. So people like Dr. Bill Darity and Kirsten Mullen have pointed out the fact that the federal government ultimately has the most resources, is in the best position, both as a matter of expertise, as a matter of dollars, in the best position to address reparations. But what we know as a matter of advocacy history, social justice history, democracy history, is that these efforts almost always and almost have to start at the local level. That's where you get the ideas. That's where you get the authenticity. That's where you create what we call, in my classes, movement momentum at the local level. Things bubble up. I'll give you a practical example. We work with the National Council of Churches and the Union of Reform Judaism, the largest Jewish denomination and the largest Christian association of churches in the country, 40 million people, right? So at least 42 million people between both organizations. What they were most interested in was working on reparations at the level of local congregations, right? So in other words, they're not starting at the DC lobbyist level, but working their way up. If we look historically in terms of reparations for Japanese Americans, right, there were essentially two efforts. The second effort was more sophisticated in that it had a sophisticated Washington lobbying component, but there were field hearings, and there was an effort to democratize the story so that Americans would get beyond, and Dreesen has nailed this, get beyond like poll testing this, like we're looking at presidential primaries, as opposed to tapping in to the conscience of the country, right? So even at that time, the majority of letters being written into Congress were against reparations to Japanese Americans, right? But the poll numbers with respect to letter writers didn't prevail. And so my point being is those local efforts are everything, right? So in other words, instead of us being judgmental and hypercritical about whether or not this small city, this large city, this state is doing reparations the way we think it must ultimately be done, they're creating the democratic roadmap for the possibility of reparations, right? In other words, it can't happen unless people buy into it. It just won't.
Thank you. Hamim, I see your hand up.
Yes, it was about this issue of the fragmented, the pros and cons of fragmented efforts. And what we see from the Latin American experience is that, for example, in the Peruvian reparations program, the legislation allowed these kind of initiatives in order to move ahead, so that the government knew that it would take a long time to create a national registry of victims, for example, right? So it would take time, many years. So in order to move ahead, let's say, open up for a civil society, for private actors, etc., different kinds of institutions to move ahead. And that's, I think that it's creative, it's inclusive, participatory, etc. But the problem is one issue of responsibility. So in transitional justice from authoritarian regimes and from armed conflict, the responsibility, the duty bearer is the state, right? So is therefore, unless they do actually initiate or at least promote these reparation programs and take the leadership, then there is no direct recognition of responsibility. So this is a difficult aspect. I just want to throw it out so to see that to what extent then do these other initiatives do actually do take the role. It's not because they're responsible, but they do want to provide something to the beneficiaries of the victims. But we should not forget the responsibility.
Thank you, Hamima. I noticed that we are at time, actually past time, so I'm going to turn it back to Lisa for just some final thoughts.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and for all of these amazing contributions, and to Carrie for moderating. I am mindful of time. However, I do think there is one question that if any of the panelists are able to answer, it might be a nice way to end the conversation, which is, what gives each of you hope in this moment of time?
Is it all of us or any of us?
Any of you?
I defer.
Yeah.
I answered, coming from a really tough week and feeling like we had gained, and we still have gained so much in getting that historic designation. And just wondering, like, why did we? I'm a person of faith and feel that, what the divine wants for us is liberation and freedom, and kind of coming to a place like, well, why is this happening? Why are we getting pushed so far back? And then being in conversation with you all today, my spirit is exploding, because I understand that, those historic designations, as they are important in the book and the formality of it, but that is not liberation, right? You cannot have liberation without the reparations part of it. And I think for me, like, I've been navigating around, well, reparations, it's really, it's controversial. I don't really want to get into it. I'm in a community that has, that is, like, in my community is predominantly Black, but the next community over is small towns, that's a white community. And like, we have generations of relationships, and it's just too difficult. And now I'm realizing what we're being called to do is truly being reparative, restorative. Like those 22,000 acres that was advertised to the world by Louisiana's Department of Environmental Quality, for the world to come in and set up businesses and set up industries and get that financial gain. That's money that is owed to us as a larger community, right? And that's Black and white, because I'm just going back to the proximity question, that proximity issue. Even if you are a white person, right, and you are next to a Black community, you are going to get cancer too, right? So it's like this movement, I really see a way in which we could all move together and really be able to have the independence collectively, no matter the race, to be able to forge our own future and to truly be liberated. So I know that's long, but I just want to tell you how much this conversation is just, again, I use the word divine, but the Lord works in mysterious ways, and you are all just so God sent. So really appreciative for your information today.
Thank you, Joy. I appreciate that and feel the same, that when we come in community, that's often what gives me hope. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to add their source of hope at these times.
I'll just, I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a minister, so this would be my benedictory note. When I think about Harriet Tubman, who led 70 people to freedom on the Underground Railroad, liberated 700 people in terms of freedom in the Low Country of South Carolina, was the first woman to lead American troops into battle. Had she compared the 770 people she freed to the 3.9 million people enslaved, she might have and should have given up. As I tell my students, hope is not empirically demonstrated, it is morally chosen. So let's not worry about the poll numbers. Let's just choose to be hopeful and get the work done.
Amen. Dreesen or Mima or Carrie, you don't necessarily have to add, but if you do feel there's something that would be, yes.
Well, actually, this very seminar, it gives me hope. So I definitely support what Joy said, and what just Cornell just shared with us. I would just note it down. Hope is morally chosen. So let's keep it up.
And hope to me is active. You know, it's nothing to aspire to. It's in the now. And so choosing to be here right now is a part of the hope. Choosing to, you know, aid the conditions to wake up this morning is part of my hope. And choosing the conditions to continue to support collective organizing and advancement of the conditions that we will thrive through is my hope. And so I will continue to dedicate actions alongside my colleagues and communities to generate what I believe is active hope.
Carrie?
I don't think I can add anything more, but I'm given hope by the words of the panelists. So thank you all for that.
Okay. And I would say that part of the motivation of the speaker panel is to remind us that there is a community, right? That we are here as a part of a collective. So I really appreciate all of your time. And for those attendees who are still here, thank you. The recording will be made available to anyone who's registered. And so that will be a follow-up email. And let's hope that this conversation continues despite the challenges. And again, we will be sending out our trends report for all of you to learn more about the 100 initiatives that we've tracked of local efforts at reparations. So there's definitely a movement underway that will continue. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe and connected.
Thank you.